In northern Iceland, archaeologists opened the ground at Glaumbær and found a longhouse about 29 meters long with outer turf walls about 1.8 meters thick. That wall was not decoration, it was winter equipment built into the house before winter arrived. Across the North Atlantic, the same pattern keeps appearing. Dry ground before walls, shelter before exposure, wool arranged by job. Traction added only when ice demanded it. Food kept dry and transportable. The old household spent less effort fighting winter after it arrived because so much of the work had already been done. The mistake today is thinking winter competence comes from owning enough products. A thicker coat, a bigger heater, a more complicated shelter, a drawer full of emergency gear. Those things can help, but the old record points somewhere else. First remove exposure, then control water, then break contact with cold ground, then manage moisture on the body. Then add the smallest tool that solves the remaining problem. The old households were not trying to make winter comfortable in the modern sense. They were trying to remove the places where cold became dangerous or expensive. A wet floor, a wet wall, a body sweating inside too much clothing. A boat launched when the season had already turned, a haystack put away too wet, a smooth sole on hard ice. Once you see winter as a chain of separate failures, the old methods stop looking strange. They look organized. I am Bjorn Haugen. I spent 31 winters commercial fishing Lake Superior and more than 40 years keeping a cellar and smokehouse running outside 2 harbors. I trust dry materials, simple numbers, and things that still work after the story has worn off them. 15. At Hrísbrú in Iceland, excavators found a straw-covered residential floor in a farm component dated to the 900s. Dry straw lay over a colder earthen surface. The principle is separation. Modern building science still treats poorly insulated floors as a comfort and heat loss problem. The useful version today is not loose straw around heaters or wiring. It is a proper dry thermal break beneath you. People notice the cold air first. Often it was the ground taking the heat. Try that one before the frost, friend. 14. On Store Nordmannsslepa, across the Hardanger Plateau, archaeologists found a stone and turf shelter dated to the 12th century. It gave travelers a place to get out of direct wind and weather before exposure became an emergency. Comparable shelters stood along a recognized route. That tells you something important. The best emergency shelter is often the one you planned to reach before you needed it. Modern gear changes the material, not the rule. Sometimes surviving bad weather means refusing to stand in it. Try that one before the frost, friend. 13. Faroese longhouses used heavy curved stone and turf outer walls around a timber interior. Timber made the room, the outer mass met the weather. Modern buildings use different materials, but the principle survives in continuous exterior insulation that reduces thermal bridging. The mistake is copying the earth and forgetting drainage, air control, structure, and moisture. A wall is not only what holds the roof up, it is what the weather has to get through. Try that one before the frost, friend. The picture most people carry of the Viking age leaves this work out. Ships and weapons make sharper stories than drainage, weaving, haymaking, and choosing not to sail. But most people were ordinary farmers and householders. The useful knowledge sits there. There are 300 more pages of Anders's journal on the shelf behind me, and I am working through them one at a time. Subscribe, and you will be here when I get to the old cold country rule for keeping wool dry without ruining it with heat. 12. Iceland's turf house tradition goes back to settlement in the 9th century. Timber carried the structure. Turf and stone wrapped it. Roofs were covered with turf as part of the weather shell. The lesson is not to put sod on a modern roof. It is uninterrupted insulation overhead with water and air handled properly. Modern cold climate roofs still live or die by insulation and moisture control. The roof worked because somebody expected to maintain it, not because the material was magical. Try that one before the frost, friend. 11. Glaumbær gives us the wall I started with, about 1.8 meters thick. That is an enormous amount of usable space surrendered to weather protection. Thickness slowed heat flow and added thermal mass. The modern lesson is not to build a 6-foot sod wall. It is to stop heat escaping through weak sections in the envelope. Continuity and dryness matter more than simply adding bulk. At Glaumbær, the walls did not merely add mass. They gave the occupied room a buffer from outside temperature change and moving air. That kind of wall cost space, labor, and constant maintenance. Modern insulation is far more efficient by thickness, But the people who built Glaumbær were willing to give up usable floor area because winter protection was not an optional feature added later. Cheap space makes thin walls tempting. Severe weather used to make that bargain harder to justify. Try that one before the frost, friend. 10. At Toftanes in the Faroe Islands, stone-lined drains were built before the longhouse. That sequence matters. The builders did not wait for a wet interior and then try to dry it. They gave water somewhere else to go first. Modern foundation work still follows that logic with grading, drainage, capillary breaks, and vapor control. Winter damp is easier to prevent than remove. The driest winter wall is often the one whose water problem was handled in summer. Try that one before the frost, friend. 9. At Kvívík, earth benches ran along the longhouse walls. People rested above the colder central floor rather than directly on it. Elevation reduces contact with a cold surface and lets bedding or clothing add more insulation. Today, the same problem is solved by raised beds, insulated pads, and better floors. The useful point is not the mud bench. It is separation from cold ground. A bed has always been more than something soft. In winter, it is a piece of the building. Try that one before the frost, friend. 8. At medieval Reykholt in Iceland, archaeology found clear evidence of geothermal use. The household used heat already present beneath the landscape instead of asking burned fuel to do every job. Modern geothermal direct-use systems follow the same principle. Most people cannot copy Reykholt in the backyard. That is fine. The lesson is to use the heat source you actually have efficiently instead of manufacturing more heat than the problem requires. The cheapest heat is sometimes the heat you stop manufacturing. Try that one before the frost, friend. 7. At Garðar in Greenland, winter preparation began while the fields were green. Research supports manuring and water management around hay production because livestock needed stored fodder after grazing stopped. That is the important reversal. The winter job happened months before winter. Modern hay guidance adds moisture numbers and fire controls, but the old planning principle is unchanged. A reserve only helps if it was made properly and stored dry. At Garðar, that same thinking moved into agriculture. Stored fodder was not something to think about when the first hard weather arrived. The reserve had to exist already. That means the important winter date was not the first snow. It was the last safe opportunity to cut, dry, and store what the animals would need when grazing stopped. Winter punishes the job you decided could wait in July. Try that one before the frost, friend. 6. 2 Norse farm middens in South Greenland produced carbonized barley grains. A modern study makes local cultivation likely in at least part of that evidence, though import cannot be ruled out in every case. The practical lesson is simpler than the archaeology. Dry grain is compact food that does not need refrigeration. Keep modern food-grade grain cool, dry, sealed, and protected from insects. A pantry looks dull until the road closes. Try that one before the frost, friend. 5. At Akurvík in northwestern Iceland, archaeologists found seasonal turf fishing structures and enormous fishbone deposits dominated by Atlantic cod. The important winter idea is transportable preserved food. The excavation does not give you a safe home fish drying recipe, so do not turn it into one. Today, the safe equivalent is commercially processed shelf-stable dried fish, used according to its label. The freezer made us forget how much work used to happen before food ever reached the house. Try that one before the frost, friend. 4. The 13th century Norwegian work Konungs skuggsjá has a section on the proper season for navigation. It argues against late-season sea travel as days shorten, water gets colder, storms increase, and harbors become harder to use. That is winter equipment made out of judgment. The best jacket in the world does not make every departure wise. Modern forecasting improves the decision, but it does not replace it. The old sea travel rule is just as plain. A person can own better clothing, a better boat, and better equipment, and still make the wrong decision at the shoreline. Modern forecasting gives you more information than a medieval traveler had. The responsibility does not change. The safest trip in bad conditions is sometimes the one you postpone. Sometimes the person waiting at home is the best reason not to leave the shore. Try that one before the frost, friend. 3. At Gásir and other medieval Icelandic sites, wool cloth shows deliberate control of fabric structure. This was not just heavy wool thrown around the body, it was cloth made to do a job. Cold weather clothing still has the same basic problems. Hold warm air. Manage body moisture. Stop moving outside air from stripping warmth away. The common mistake is getting too warm during work, soaking the layers with sweat, and then stopping. Most cold clothing fails first when a person gets too warm in it. Try that one before the frost, friend. 2. Eyrbyggja Saga preserves a small detail during a fight on slippery ice. One man repeatedly loses his footing. Freystein is described wearing shoe spikes and standing firm. The old term is skuggsjá. The useful idea is removable specialization. Ordinary footwear became ice footwear only when the surface required it. Modern removable cleats do the same job. Put them on for ice and pack snow. Take them off when the surface changes. The shoe spike example is small, but it makes the whole argument visible. You do not need a completely different winter shoe for every surface. You need to know when ordinary footwear has reached its limit. Add traction for the ice. Remove it when the surface changes. That is a more disciplined way to use equipment than wearing the most aggressive option all day because you paid for it. The useful piece of winter equipment is often the one you put on for 20 yards and take off again. Try that one before the frost, friend. 1. The Herjólfsnes finds from Norse Greenland preserved wool garments, hoods, caps, and woven stockings. These were separate pieces doing separate jobs around the body. Many were worn and patched. That matters. The old system was adjustable. Add a layer, open one, remove one, repair one, put it back into service. Modern cold weather guidance still recommends loose layers, insulation, and a wind-resistant outer layer. The real skill is adjustment. Open or remove a layer before hard work, so sweat does not soak the system. Change wet clothing. Dry wool away from direct heat. Protect head, neck, hands, and feet for the conditions. And the clothing system works the same way as the shoe spikes. More insulation is not always more safety. If work makes you sweat, trapped moisture changes the problem. You are no longer only trying to stay warm. Now you are trying to stay dry enough that the insulation still works when you stop moving. That is why adjustment matters. A layer you can open or remove can be more useful than another layer you cannot manage. That is number 1 because it is ordinary. A good winter coat is useful. Knowing when to open it is better. Try that one before the frost, friend. Put all 15 together and the pattern becomes plain. Straw over cold ground. A refuge on an exposed route. Heavy walls. Turf overhead. Drainage before construction. A raised place to rest. Natural heat where the land provided it. Hay made while the fields were green. Dry grain, transportable food. A sailing season chosen instead of challenged. Dense wool. Removable traction. Adjustable layers. The form changes. The job does not. The old household solved the physical problem first and selected the object second. That is the part worth keeping. There is one winter I think about whenever I talk about wool. 2003. I dried wool sweaters on the rack by the stove because it was the warmest place in the house. One of them was my mother's knitting. It came off that rack 2 sizes smaller and hard as a board. I still have it in a drawer upstairs because I could not bring myself to do anything else with it. Wool dries away from heat now, all of it. That is why old knowledge matters to me. Not because every old object deserves copying, it matters because competence is knowing the job before you choose the tool. You can buy excellent winter equipment and still use it badly. You can own ordinary wool and manage it well. You can have a good house and ignore where water is moving. You can own ice cleats and leave them in the closet until after the fall. You can own a freezer and still understand why a shelf-stable reserve matters. For one small weekend job, start under the shoe. Use the winter footwear you already own and one correctly sized removable traction device made for ordinary walking on ice and packed snow. Fit it before the first icy morning. Make sure it sits correctly. Use it on the surface it was designed for. Take it off when you return to cleared pavement, gravel, or sanded road. Then wipe it, air dry it, and store it dry. What did your family keep that worked like this? A winter habit from Minnesota, Maine, Alberta, Yorkshire, Tasmania, wherever you are. Put the region with it. Next time I am staying with wool. There is an old cold country rule about getting it dry without ruining it with heat. I will leave the result where it belongs until there is one. A good winter household does not win by owning the most equipment. It wins by understanding what each piece is for. There are 300 more pages of Anders's journal on the shelf behind me, and I am working through them one at a time. Subscribe and you will be here when I get to that old cold country rule for keeping wool dry without ruining it with heat. Keep the old ways warm, friend. They kept us.